Hello and welcome to Make It Conscious. Today we're going to be continuing with this series on the future of work. Today's episode is all about the current situation, the current workplace crisis. Is there a crisis? Why is it happening? What does it consist of? And of course, to understand where we are, we've got to understand where we came from. In this series so far, we've talked about the value of work, why from a psycho-spiritual perspective, work is necessary, why it forms a cornerstone of any form of self-knowledge. You come to know yourself through work. Work is also a product of you, and the more you know yourself, the more you can actually contribute in a meaningful way. So the discussion of work and the discussion of self-knowledge and consciousness are intrinsically linked at many levels. One of the obvious contemporary ones, of course, is AI, right? The development of AI, the influx of AI into the public use in 2022, beginning with ChatGPT, and that's brought many conversations around what is intelligence, what is consciousness, out into mainstream discourse. These are topics that have been going on a long time, of course, but becoming much more public and widespread. And that kind of encounter is inevitable, so we're going to be talking about that more. First, though, I want to bring it all back to a quote by Georg Hegel. And now you might have heard me say this before, and that is that the history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. Now, bearing in mind, he said this in the early 19th century, so 200 years has passed. And the interesting thing about Hegel is that he was trying to find, like many philosophers do, a macro perspective, a systematic perspective. And I think where a lot of understanding of Hegel goes off the rails is that they miss the principled aspect of what he's saying. Now, he was establishing principles of how society evolves, how history evolves, and how consciousness evolves. And those same principles, I think it's pretty fair to say, continue to unfold to this very day. The particulars of how he described it, they may well be morphing. I think that's actually the point. I think that's a feature, not a bug. And so that's a principle that I am bringing to this conversation. If you search podcasts on AI or the changing nature of work, you're unlikely to find a quote by Hegel at the start of the conversation. But from where I'm sitting, this is actually the most useful lens through which to understand what is actually going on. So what does he mean? The history of the world, the progression of the consciousness of freedom. Well, according to Hegel, our consciousness, the consciousness of spirit itself, unfolds through contradiction. It makes a stand, it makes a thesis, it moves, and that automatically sets up contradiction. He saw history as the journey of God becoming realized, or the absolute becoming realized. Spirit, Geist, mind. These words are to some extent interchangeable with Hegel. And so what that means is that everything that served you, us, human beings, in the past at some point, it served a purpose. It was an upgrade. It established a moment of history. It increased freedom. Whether it was agriculture, whether it was any invention, whether it was the Industrial Revolution, whether it was the invention of the computer, the silicon chip, all of these were vehicles towards greater realization. And yet, everything can be a vehicle and everything can be a trap. So what was once a vehicle for an individual, for a society, like this isn't a sudden thing. This is a gradual thing that unfolds like a wave throughout groups of people, throughout cultures. Everything that was a vehicle becomes a trap eventually. It starts to insist on itself. It insists on itself anyway, but it reaches a point where, like if you've seen my Mapping the Shadow series, you might be aware of this dynamic already. It reaches a point where it becomes self-contradictory, or it becomes one-sided. So whatever the invention is, it reaches a point where it has to reconcile with what's been left out. It starts to betray the very thing it initially set out to achieve. And so, speaking quite abstractly here, we're going to get to some pretty clear examples which we can all relate to. But that's the core principle of what I'm discussing in this series. In fact, in most of my work, this is a key theme that I keep coming back to. So let's look at some actual patterns of work throughout time. On this slide here, for those watching on video, I've broken this down into 3 very broad phases. They are the ancient era, pretty broad brush name that, but I'll justify it in a second, right? So we've got the ancient era, the early modern era, beginning around about the 15th century to 1970. And then from 1970 to today, I've actually got 2029 here, for reasons I will explain. This is the information era, or as I've coined it here. So I want to make clear here that this is a very present day centric view of what's led up to this point. It's taken the present day as naturally a point of reference. That's not to imply, though, that it's the most important time or that change is happening faster. I made the point in a recent episode that I think change often looks like it's happening faster, but I think that's a phenomenon that probably happens every state in history. So just taking some of the main themes here, like the ancient era, whatever we want to demarcate that as, from around 10,000 years ago to the 15th century, don't get me wrong, there were many, many, many pivotal changes within that period. But just generalizing here from our own point of reference, before the 15th century, work, generally speaking, was largely a system of collective survival and based around seasonal rhythms. Hierarchical, tradition-based systems. Again, within that, there was all kinds of change, right? There was all kinds of new inventions coming online. There was the invention of the printing press some time ago, the invention of writing in ancient Babylon, all the way up to international trade happening on a much larger scale. So many changes are kind of just blended into this era. But the point is that it was largely about survival. Now, of course, there were many folks who were able to move beyond that. That's why we have culture. That's why we have art. But at least in terms of our perspective here, that function of work has largely evolved, or is evolving still. This is the progress of freedom. So moving on then, around the 15th century, a lot of things changed. One thing that changed was the invention of the printing press. Pretty key moment in time from our point of view here. Work became more systemized, more systematic, scientific as well. This is a gradual development, but culminating in the industrial transformation, starting around the 18th century, which again developed gradually. The invention of steam power, right? And now we're talking about greater ability to travel, first by plane, also by boat, also by plane eventually. So greater interconnectivity. And there are also astrological and analogues to this, by the way. This isn't the place to go into them, but I think it's a point that is probably worth exploring at some point. That's one reason I chose these timelines here. These align with the work of a guy called Terry McKinnell, who has done some very interesting work on macro astrology. And so round about the mid-15th century, he makes the case that that's actually when the age of Aquarius began, albeit in a very gradual way. And so that we're still in what he calls the overflow period of Pisces, but with Aquarius coming in. If you know nothing about astrology, or you don't so-called believe in astrology, it doesn't matter. We're just talking in terms of a symbolic analog here, to say nothing of causality or anything like this. It's just a very useful way to understand some of the pattern changes here. And so, for example, what Aquarius is associated with is humanity, technological development, revolution, abundance in certain ways. So using technology, leveraging natural forces to, in principle, create abundance. And so that gives you the industrial, well, there was other reasons for the Industrial Revolution. It had to do with Capricorn and science. But it's interesting how all these various symbols blend together and produce a pretty compelling storyline for that's actually meaningful and captures some of the main themes. So then it hits 1970, huge change. Going from systemization, which was very, very productive at the time, immense amounts of collateral damage, no doubt. I mean, none of us today would want to work, I don't think, in the factories of the Victorian era. You got kids being forced to work 6, maybe even 7 days a week, 10-hour days, just horrendous abuse and very, very hard work. Now, there was, of course, loads of complaint about that at the time. People who had been making things like cloth by candlelight suddenly found themselves out of work, very understandably. Suddenly it was possible to make a lot of cloth a lot more cheaply. Fine, it wasn't handmade, but overall, culture chose the mass-produced equivalent over the finer equivalent. The benefits of the handmade stuff wasn't enough to meaningfully outweigh the perceived benefits of mass production. And so pretty much for the next almost 200 years, a lot of the benefits came from industrialization of one form or another. Doing things faster, maintaining specification, but doing them faster, cheaper, and sometimes to a high quality, often not. And so in quite a significant way, we've now started to see the dark side of that. For those of you who are familiar, again, with my shadow map model, same principle applies. The idea that carried this movement forward at some point became corrupt and even performative and like missing the point of the exercise. Because of course, if you just double down on a single metric or any idea, like how expensive it is to produce something, you see this now in simple things, everyday things like chocolate bars or toilet paper. From one perspective, the manufacturer's like, well, how much does it cost to produce 100,000 Mars bars? Now and in the future, what's the cost comparison from now to last decade? But what they conveniently, through their own selective perception, often tend to overlook is that you cannot equate a Mars bar today with a Mars bar from 10 years ago, or even however far back in time you want to go. For some reason, I remember when I was a kid, a Mars bar was 65 grams and it cost about 30 pence. And I remember, because I was learning about money and numbers at the time, I remember seeing the price creep up to like 31, 32, 33. And I just remember them being incredibly delicious when I was a kid. And I'm sure they still are. I haven't eaten one in a long time. But whenever I have eaten something like that in recent years, I often get the sense that it's just not how it used to be. It's hard to quantify, but I'm just left with a sense that it doesn't taste as good as I remember. And of course, the most obvious feature is that they're much, much smaller than they used to be. This is what's now known as shrinkflation. So you get less for your money, even in real terms, let alone nominal terms. In other words, the value of the dollar, the pound, the yen, the euro is going down pretty drastically. And even still, the actual thing you're buying, what we call a Mars bar or whatever it is objectively becoming of worse quality and of lower value. So this is a dark side, a byproduct of the obsession with industrialization. And that seems to have reached its peak, not just astrologically, but also in observable phenomena around 1970. And so at that point, we then enter the information era. Similar thing starts to happen. And that is reaching its peak now. So that goes some way to presenting the lead up to where we are. And so how many of the features of the crisis that we're now experiencing, quiet quitting, loss of jobs, difficulty hiring, cost of living, all of these things, they can be related to this somehow. The abundance of information is pretty much here. I mean, AI has certainly made it even more available because now you can just ask AI a question and get information even faster. But a lot of these symptoms are related to this, reaching a peak in something, and that is this information era and what's coming next. So that's a very concise build up to where we are. I just want to go to a quote now by a chap called Robert Quillen, who in 1928, almost 100 years ago, quipped that Americanism is using money you haven't earned to buy things you don't need to impress people you don't like. This has often been misquoted to Tyler Durden, character from Fight Club. No, it was first written by this guy, Robert Quillen, in a newspaper. This, I think, neatly summarizes much of the current situation and the core contradiction that's leaving many folks to make a change. For some, it's very thought through. For others, it's felt pretty intensely. And for many, many more, it's just kind of seemingly happening. Either they're making a change and not really knowing why they're doing it, or society around them is going some way to force a change, whether through market forces, whether through just making it pretty much unviable to work whatever job they're looking to get or would otherwise have gotten. Where I'm from in the UK, and I think this is a similar situation in many places, occasionally I might visit the home counties, so like the Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire kind of area. And the word on the street down there, it's not really a street at all, it's a giant open countryside landscape. Pubs throughout this area are just dropping like flies. They just keep closing. And when you speak to their owners, the reasoning is always the same. We just can't find the staff. Because who wants to travel that far just to work for minimum wage in a pub in the middle of the countryside? It's actually less and less economically viable for them. And that's even with minimum wage rising to where it is. I don't know the exact minimum wage right now, but I know that it's well into double digits. So it's £12 an hour or something now, which means that someone working full time on minimum wage is making in the lower 20,000s per year, which when I graduated from university, that was actually more or less the average graduate salary. So that was back in 2009. So fast forward a decade and a half, and that's now the minimum wage for a full-time employee. So massive changes there in the nominal value of the pound or how much is getting paid. And yet it's still not enough to justify, because the price of everything has just gone up so much due to inflation, sure. And so this is, I think, the natural result of this kind of phenomenon. What Quillen coins Americanism, and of course it's not just Americanism, this is a global cultural phenomenon which can be drawn back to a Western phenomenon which has its roots in the US, sure, and the way the financial system is structured. But I'm making the case here also that this is actually deeper than just these mechanics, right? This is actually a psychological unfolding, maybe even a symbolic unfolding, and that is of freedom itself. All of these things made sense at one point. They all served a purpose. Debts, using money, there's good debt and bad debt. Same idea. Everything is bivalence. But take that to its extreme, and it's interesting the timing of Quillen's quote here, because that was right before the start of the Great Depression. So clearly this same set of problems was very visible then, and actually causing the greatest financial crash we've known so far. So some similar patterns are unfolding here, and it's not the same, but some of the similar phenomena are happening here, and that's leading to the current crisis. People questioning, do we really need to buy this stuff? Is this really something I'm deciding on intrinsically, or is this something I'm being lobbied into doing? Do I really need to impress these folks? Are they really pulling me forward? Is this actually conducive to my own development? And in my language, development is synonymous with self-knowledge. It's one thing to learn a skill. It's one thing to integrate something into your mind, into your awareness, to develop a relationship with yourself. And you can do that through work, you can do that through learning skills. But ultimately, if you're just learning skills to get something, that will take you so far. But is it the full suite of tools you need in order to develop meaningful self-knowledge? At some point, the mind rebels. And at some point, all these contradictions come to the surface. They can exist for some time. They can remain undivided in relative harmony for some time. But it's not really harmony. It's really a lack of differentiation. The only reason we feel comfortable for a time when we're in such a situation as working for a slave driver of a boss or a company that isn't really doing good things in the world, we can tolerate that for a time, maybe. And that's probably because we have other things to deal with psychologically at that time. There's other things we're working on at that point that are coming into awareness, because there can only really be a limited number at any one time. But at some point, these contradictions are going to emerge and your world is going to split apart, and you're going to have to come face to face with them and find a resolution. So even though this is a almost 100-year-old quote, I feel that it is still pretty relevant to today. So what are the actual trends that I'm talking about? Well, here's 5, recognizable, I think, to most people. The first is quiet quitting. Employees are checking out mentally. But here's the thing, they're staying employed and not being honest with that about their employers. Now, on the flip side, a lot of employers naturally see this as a problem, but also something they have to kind of manage or mediate or employ some kind of organizational medicine to make the problem go away. But what is generally forgotten here is that this is a response to how employees have been treated for decades. This is in a similar kind of way, and I don't like to make this comparison, but the power dynamic of a parent and their child. And often when a child rebels, it's because on some level they recognize the hypocrisy of their parents. Not always. Of course, a child is a free being just like anyone else. But a lot of the time, it's a pretty natural, albeit unarticulated and misunderstood rebellion to the parents' so-called good intentions, which are actually self-serving, whether they're aware of that or not. And in a similar kind of way, employers, since the start, have pretty much, most of them, until relatively recently, have seen humans as resources. The Human Resources Department. It's implicit in the name. Resources. Human, sure, but still resources to be utilized. And as long as you see humans as mere resources, the human aspect is going to rear its head. Let's go through the rest succinctly here. The Great Resignation, so similar to the first one, mass voluntary departures, people just leaving without alternatives to go to. They get so stuck and so desperate that they just kind of have to leave, and maybe even feel they have to leave in order for anything else to come about. Maybe the demands of their work are so severe that they feel they actually can't find anything else unless they just take a leap. Number 3 is the remote work revolution, of course. Number 4, skills gap crisis. Employers unable to find qualified workers, despite there being apparently so many people unemployed. And lastly, value conflicts between generations. So let's just go through these briefly. So remote work, this has been a feature of work for a long time. Even when I started work in the early late 2000s, this was already a thing. And it was already a thing before that. But at that point, it was largely restricted to those that worked in technology. So technology companies or senior executives, people who had the autonomy to make such decisions for themselves. And I remember even in 2009, 2010, I think it was, the UK politician who hadn't been Prime Minister at that point, but Boris Johnson, who then later became PM, at the time said that home working sounds like a skiver's paradise. And yet in less than 13 years, he himself was forced to work at home when he caught COVID. So didn't have much foresight there. Clearly, this was not just some random bug. This was a valid and viable feature of the need for freedom, the need for not just location independence, but actually increased productivity. They need to get away from that performative aspect of work. And as I've written on the slide here, when this actually was forced upon much of the world in 2020 and beyond through the pandemic, well, that just went to show how much of work was actually performative rather than productive. And that's just something that cannot be denied. I'll come back to that because I want to talk about my own experience. But first, let's go to the next point here. Skills gap crisis. So despite there being so many people unemployed, apparently, employers just can't find people to do the jobs. And we're going to talk about AI in a moment too. There have been many predictions that have said that basically AI is going to replace jobs, or at least replace jobs of a certain level. This is a whole conversation that I'm very skeptical of because, firstly, it's the wrong premise. A job is not a unit of good. I know that's something that societies measure, governments measure, and they have certain targets around that. But a job is something that an individual tries to meet. It's a form of specification. And I think this is completely the wrong kind of thinking for where the world is going. It ought not be merely about meeting specification. It really needs to be something that's much more self-driven and contributing uniqueness. And I think that's something we're seeing in many ways and have been for a long time that's happening anyway. So there's a choice to be made between those that want to leverage the current changes to express and discover themselves versus those that use it as ever more elaborate opportunity for self-avoidance. We're going to see both. And not only that, but a lot of these meaningless roles, so-called, will naturally be automated. Someone who's worth listening to in this whole conversation is a guy called Jacob Morgan. And he makes a very interesting point that he doesn't see it like technology is taking away human jobs. He sees it that machines are going to be doing work that humans should never have been doing at all. Of course, humans have been doing menial work, and there was a good reason for that. But the changes we're seeing in technology really are, again, an expression of this development of the consciousness of freedom. And that always brings pain, that always brings harm and damage, but it also brings something that has to come in to our world either way. So it's difficult, but it also means having to step up. So lastly, generational value conflicts, the fact that younger generations have different values. Now, not a lot of thought has gone into why this is. One reason is simply that sometimes it just takes a generation to change things. Each generation themselves can do a certain amount of work and adaptation, but many folks, has to be said, just resist that transformation. Now, on this channel, I talk about shadow work, I talk about individuation. These are all about both of those things, adaptation and transformation. If all you ever did was merely adapt, you're just doubling down on this idea of yourself, that's going to get you stuck. Ultimately, the world will force a change. So we have to have both. We have to have this arc of adaptation and the arc of transformation back. But a lot of our challenges as individuals can actually be chalked up to the fact that people don't want to transform. They just want to double down on an idea of themselves, whether it's the person who's best at their job, the world's best coder, or the world's best athlete, or whatever it is. And there's something heroic about that. But the true hero's journey is that he encounters his dark side. Because beyond a point, this adaptation, just trying to be really, really the best at what you do, it becomes a form of inflation, right? It becomes an attraction to an idea, a partial idea, a business card, an image of yourself. And that's no longer heroic. That actually becomes another form of avoidance, right? It's like success is measured by how many things outside of itself it doesn't have to deal with or tolerate or endure. So eventually, like, all that busyness and productivity becomes just another form of defense. And often it takes new blood to actually see that. And sometimes, as I alluded to earlier, that's actually something that happens largely intuitively. Younger generations looking up to their superiors, whether it be parents, whether it be bosses, whether it be the thinkers that came before them, there's something in each of us that naturally rebelled against violations of our freedom. And this is really important to understand. It's not articulated often enough that when we feel angry, when we rebel in some way, there's not always, because that can just be, again, another defense, and a pure defense against our conscious thesis of ourselves. But on some level, it's also a rejection of a violation. Like, even someone who is completely pathological, a psychopath or a narcissist, even their desire to bend the world to themselves is rooted in a arrested early stage attempt to establish independence and freedom. And it's only because of, well, crucially, their own free will, but also the conditions they came under, which at least condition that kind of response. There's always free will involved. You'll know that if you've seen my other content, read my essays and so on. It's a combination of both of those things. Great challenge can lead to great growth. It can also lead to even greater self-avoidance, depending on what the individual chooses to do. That means that younger generations just kind of naturally tend to flush out everything that doesn't work before. They see things fresh, they see the contradiction, whether intuitively, whether in their feelings, or whether thinking it through. So this adds a kind of timed element to this whole unfolding. And so what are the catalysts here? Well, clearly technology is a key part of this. Many of the discussion on this topic sees technology as the cause in itself. And hopefully I've made clear that I think it's caused by something psychological, but nonetheless, there's a real key catalyst here in AI. And artificial intelligence is really forcing us to ask the question, what makes humans irreducibly human? So it reveals which work activities were always mechanical versus genuinely the remit of a human. So it's important to point out here that there's a movement that is almost kind of has this quasi-religious view of AI, that it's the natural successor to not just humanity, but presumably biological life in general, and that it's going to become conscious. And even believing it's conscious already purely on how it leaves us, the impression it gives us. It can sometimes feel like we're having a conversation with it, even though that might just be a kind of psychological transference. Now, I think this is not a settled debate. However, I certainly lean towards the fact that AI is essentially, and this is based on what I've seen so far and also just thinking it through, very good at machinating what exists. It's fundamentally very different from a mind, let alone a human mind. And that the idea that it is like a mind or that it's conscious in some way seems to be a natural corollary to a materialist worldview that reduces consciousness to the brain, or at least attempts to and tries to, even though there's not a huge amount of proof of that. There's certainly a relationship there, clearly. But can consciousness be reduced to the brain? No. I don't think there's any evidence for that. Now, in the kind of most ironic sort of way, it proves the projection of this understanding into the system. In other words, if you believe that everything in existence is purely matter, that's essentially materialism, then of course that includes your brain, and then that's going to be felt in a machine. If a machine can imitate a brain, then presumably the machine becomes conscious. That's the perspective, broadly speaking. But of course, the idealist perspective, or the idealist paradigm, generally would say that actually mind is the forerunner. And therefore, anything that merely computes is not truly a mind. Because what does a mind do? Well, it engages with the implicit. It involves an interaction between conscious and unconscious. It mediates between the two. And AI is not doing that. It's simply machinating in a very sophisticated way what already is actualized. It's not creating in the sense of accessing what's implicit or unconscious, whereas a human mind can do that. So it can produce the impression of that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what it's doing. Now, whether through some mechanism that can then lead to a conscious computer, I lean on the side of that not being possible, but I'm certainly open to argument and evidence that suggests otherwise. The second catalyst here, of course, is generational evolution. And I just discussed this, how each generation develops a higher awareness of freedom, and that younger workers, through their need for self-determination and through the openness of their minds, sees through the power dynamics more readily than those that came before them. Now, this is very generally speaking, because there'll always be older folks who see through this stuff very clearly. There'll always be younger folks who, no matter what happens to them, no matter what is falling down in the world around them, will just interminably just basically do what is expected of them by the outside world. They will never question whether it's what's right for them. They have no interest in an inner dialectic. They're just meeting specification. And as long as they're doing that, they feel safe, right? This is a product of a mind that is split and placing itself in the world around it, using the world around it to placate its own tension. It's a futile task, but nonetheless, there are many folks who will take it to its very end. And that's why often when these things unfold, they happen as a forced phenomenon, not something that's happening proactively. Basically, all the warning signs will be there. Every light on your dashboard is blaring, saying, you need to change your oil, you need to refuel your petrol, you need to change your brakes, everything. And they just ignore it and ignore it and ignore it because they're tuning into the radio, and the radio is saying, everything's fine. The world is a happy place. You'll be safe. Just do what we say. Get a job. get a degree, all this stuff. And that kind of comforting, soothing voice of the pre-approved message of the world makes them feel comfortable until the moment the wheels fall off. And then it's like, okay, I guess I better get out and fix something. That's why COVID, as an example, created this sudden shift to remote working, even though that was something that was not only possible, but a tremendous opportunity right until that point. So, my own personal experience, I wanted to touch on that. The last time I worked for a corporate organization as an employee was 2015 is when I left. And it really amazed me because even a few years after graduation, I was still trying to get my head around the degree to which organizations would resist change and resist efficiency and resist doing the right things, let alone doing them well. One example of this was, for example, if we had to offer a deal to a customer, it had to go through a team whose entire job, essentially, was to check the deal for commercial viability, which by and large was really a question of making sure this number was less than that number, this number was more than that number, and it was really a number checking exercise. There was a degree of flexibility and thought that had to go into it too, but from what I could see, this was a very, very simple exercise. And not only that, this team presented a bottleneck to my team that meant that every deal had to go through them. So if I met a customer and I said, hey, yes, I'll get this offer to you, it would have to go through this team first. And so rather than acknowledging that and trying to collaborate, what this particular team did was limit the periods in which it would check deals to 2 days a week. So not only were they a bottleneck, but they actually embraced that fact. I think realizing that actually they could try to dig their heels in and justify their existence even more because they, on some deep level, knew that they weren't actually adding any value and that it really wasn't necessary. This is a great example of something that really could have very easily been done by software. And we're talking a whole team of several people here. So rather than do what was right for the organization, what was better for the organization, they, through apparent fear, just tried to justify their existence as far as practically possible and never even entertain the opposite side. If anything, actually do the opposite in a reaction. That was just one example, but there's countless examples of like that. And that was really the norm that I encountered in the corporate working world more than the exception, at least at that point in time, 10 plus years ago, 10, 15 years ago, let's say. And around the same time, maybe in 2014 or so, I know it's trite to say it now, but I read The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, and it got me thinking in a very different way. It got me thinking in a very proactive and self-reliant way. And I started thinking, well, if I just, because I was really interested in fitness and supplements at the time, I thought if I just make this supplement and sell it on Amazon, I can like just punch some numbers and I only need to sell 10 a day to replace the income that I'm on now. And so that got me incredibly inspired. And within a year, that's exactly what I was doing. And at one point, I'd managed to spend merely a few hours really on a project that was within a few months making more money for me than my actual day job at the time. And so it was running just semi-passively on the side whilst I was working, and it still needed work. But in terms of the number of hours I was putting into it, it was laid out so clear to me that this was the way forward. It was to become self-reliant and don't tolerate the violations of freedom that I was being subjected to. Because what it was is my time in that organization was probably 10% efficient. So as much as there was the sweet cushion of the company around me and the brand strength and the infrastructure and all the assets that it had, that essentially I could go out and sell things that were easily into the 7-figure range and I would be paid a small percentage of that. However, the cost on the value of my time was just untenable. And I think it was for everyone in that organization. And it's very telling actually that particular organization then sold, and it was around an 8,000 or 9,000 person company, and it sold for a good amount. It sold for, I think, £12 billion. But around the same time, WhatsApp sold to Facebook for $19 billion and it had 55 employees. So just admittedly, that was one of the most valuable, probably the most valuable business deal in terms of like value per employee that's ever been done. But the great irony was that they were actually producing a technology that the company I was working for was trying to do as well and was struggling to maneuver to achieve. So it was very, very telling. There was just so many signs at the time that I had to move on and do things my own way and be more productive. So yeah, I was seeing through the power dynamics. I wasn't willing to tolerate them, and no one was apparently willing to meet me in the middle in that organization, which is understandable because there was a lot of them. But anytime I tried to speak up, I was pretty much told to shut up and get back in my box. So, but the 4-hour work week is an interesting one. It's quite old now, and many of the tips are dated. But the principle of leveraging your time well, productivity tips combined with leverage, these are great principles that not only individuals ought to bear in mind, but even organizations as well. And that, actually, this leads me on to the third point on this current slide here, the third catalyst, which is very simply information transparency. This is also a function of the age, right? The information age. Symbolically speaking, for those astrologically inclined, this would be a Gemini influence, largely with some other things combined. And there's just no hiding anymore for a lot of this stuff. This is also where the birth of so-called conspiracy theories came from, which, whilst it wasn't coined around the death of JFK, it was certainly a term that became much more commonly used, presumably as a way to discredit those that thought that the mainstream story wasn't quite adding up. But where that's led to now is that it's very hard to hide. Social media and just connectivity generally, communication, online articles, information of all kind, has exposed all of this, not least workplace hypocrisy on a scale that is unprecedented to this point in time. So all of these old structures, as power structures always do, is coming under ever increasing pressure. And what served in the past naturally becomes obsolete eventually. That's what we're seeing. And a sort of call to action here is to practice sensitivity to this dynamic in a general sense, but also to when a system no longer serves. Stop and get out the car before the wheels fall off. So, last slide now. The implications of this. Well, I see 3 primary ones. The first, as I've already discussed, really, is that this is actually a process of consciousness evolution. Even that sounds a bit trite now, like the word of consciousness evolution. I mean, that is what it is, but maybe we can just go back to Hegel's words and think of it in terms of the progression of the consciousness of freedom, not just doing what you want all the time. That's not freedom. That's just heedlessness. That's just really another form of slavery. But the evolution of mind itself and the resolution of contradiction, that's what it means. It's not merely just random or technological workplace disruption. This has a prior cause in mind itself. And the fact that we're reaching a kind of breaking point. Now, I think there's based on Terry McKinnell's work, there's a major shift coming in 2029, and it's pretty clear that we're leading towards something like that, which is seemingly to do with this, what is often termed the information age, reaching a kind of peak where the benefits become maximized and extracted, and the downsides and the externalities start to really impose themselves ever more on the world and you and me and everyone in it, until it can simply no longer be ignored. And for those that do ignore it, don't want to see it, and just want to clutch to what they've been doing for their entire working lives, the change is no longer a negotiable point. It actually forces itself on you. So we are reaching a kind of tipping point here in regards to the contradictions of the old world of work and the future of work. And so that means there's really 2 paths ahead. This is the third point. One is authentic development, using this as an opportunity to free yourself up from machine-related tasks and develop genuine self-knowledge in its place. That's naturally an uncomfortable task. It has to be. There's no growth without pain, as Jung has said, as is pretty much implicit in every major religion, spiritual practice. If your spiritual tradition is not saying that there's pain and growth, then it's not legitimate. That's a pretty clear-cut rule of thumb there. Naturally, we don't like pain because it means going against what we've done before. It means going against what appeared to work for us in the past, did work for us in the past. But that becomes outmoded and obsolete at some point. And so it means confronting that and being willing to endure that and knowing that that produces a new way forward. That is the work of synthesis. So there's authentic development versus the attempt to find ever more sophisticated forms of avoidance leading to forced transformation. So it's happening whether you like it or not, whether I like it or not, but it's also an opportunity. So that has been a discussion on the current crisis. This is all setting the scene now for the future of work. And so in this whole series, this episode and the next episode can really be thought of as the heart of this whole discussion, keeping it very real, very practical, what's happening now, what you're seeing on the ground, and what's coming next. So in the next episode here, we're going to be talking about what's coming next, the current trajectory. So the very visible trends that are actually happening and what that's going to mean for the next 2, 5, 10 years going forward. But for now, I will thank you for your time and attention. Hope you found that useful and enjoyable, and I look forward to seeing you in a future episode. Thank you.